Cast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to another great webinar from CPA Academy. My name is Beryl, and I'll be your moderator for today's webinar, D&I One-on-One Lived Experience. I've got our presenters, Jina and Lindsay here. I'm going to turn things over to them in just a minute. But before we get started, I want to go through some housekeeping items and do some quick technical checks to make sure everything is working on your end. First of all, if you don't mind going to the GoToWebinars questions tab on your control panel, letting me know you can hear my voice and see our title slide. You should be able to see our presenters as well. Let me know where in the world you are listening in from. I always love seeing where you are tuning in from today. Now, if anyone has any technical trouble during today's webinar, please let me know in our questions panel. Keep in mind, there are quite a few of you here, and I'll do my best to get around to you as quickly as I can. This is also where you are welcome to put on any questions or comments you have today for our presenter. All right, let me check in on that questions panel. I can see you all chiming in. Looking good from St. Louis. We've got Pennsylvania, North Carolina, Washington, D.C. I'm in the DMV as well. Colorado, Pennsylvania. All right, fabulous. Now that I know everything is working, let's go through some housekeeping. Today's webinar qualifies for 1 CPE credit. The way you earn that credit today is fairly straightforward. Just stay logged in for 50 minutes of our session and answer the poll questions. We'll have a total number of 4 polls during today's webinar, and to earn full credit, you'll need to answer at least 3 of them. Now, if you're on a mobile device, you might need to click your polling answer a few times and scroll down to find the submit button. And if you have to log out and log back in for any reason at all, our system will keep track of your time. I wanted to let you know we are recording today's webinar, and the archive, along with your CPE credit, will be available in your CPA Academy account within 24 hours. We also do recommend that you download today's presentation materials, which you'll find in the control panel's handouts tab. All right, that is all from me. We are all set, so let me welcome our first presenter, Jina. I'm going to turn the floor over to you.
I had to make sure my mic was back on. Thank you, Beryl. I appreciate it. And welcome everyone for joining us. By the way, the first name I saw in the panel was somebody's name, and it pronounced, in my mind, I pronounced it as John Mayer. And I was like, oh, the artist. Oh, wait, no. Anyway, thank you all for joining us. And I'd love to introduce our guest today. With me today is Lindsay Stevenson. She's the Chief Transformation Officer at BPM. And she's the current chair of the AICPA Women's Initiatives Executive Committee. She was named as one of the 25 most powerful women in accounting in 2018, 2019, and 2020 by the AICPA and the CPA Practice Advisor, and Outstanding Young CPA of the Year by AICPA. Lindsay is a huge Gonzaga Bulldogs basketball fan and has been known to yell at the TV during games, thinking they can actually hear her. She's an avid reader of mystery novels and a total fangirl, self-described, of Simon Sinek. So Lindsay, thank you for joining us. And I wonder, is there any particular mystery novel you might suggest or recommend for those out there listening who share that passion?
Well, thank you so much for inviting me to join you today, Jina. I'm very excited to be here. And as far as mystery novels go, I would say there's a series called In Death. I don't even know how many books there are now. There's over 40, but I get pulled into those, and it's a future woman cop who kicks butt. So, you know, women, powerful, kicking the bad guys. It's one of my favorites. So
there's kind of a theme between that and what we're talking about today. You know, so it's Women's History Month. And when I reached out to you about joining to talk on this series, this conversation sort of naturally unfolded. Particularly the title came up with lived experience because you were really passionate about the importance of women being part of the conversation to address the challenges that we face in the profession. And by the way, somebody said "Go Duke" in the chat. So I don't know if that's a good thing or a bad thing. I know nothing about, is this college basketball? But I'm sorry, I digress.
It is college basketball, but I'll tell you what, I will be kind because we're on a webinar and I don't want anyone to think uncharitably about me, but no, do not go Duke. I'll just say that.
Got it. I feel the love coming already. Somebody did say they love Simon Sinek. So
good.
if we could start, when I was talking to you about the idea behind the webinar and we got to this topic, what is it that draws to you, makes you so passionate about it?
Yeah, I mean, one, I'm a woman, so I feel like there's, so many things that I've experienced or that I've shared experience with other women or even just heard their stories and just recognize that it's such a unique sort of life path, right? And women have so many different forks in the road, and there's so many things that come up in their lifetimes. Some of it because society is built that way, some of it because of their family structure. It seems like you just really never know what you're going to get. And so because those experiences are so unique, I think just the plethora of experience a woman brings to the table from a professional standpoint is so dynamic and special. And we just don't have a lot of conversation about it. We talk about all the things they need to do to fit in the mold and really don't talk about all the amazing things they're doing outside the mold, and maybe the mold should change. And so I just get really excited talking about that because I just think women are just so unique and incredible, and I really love exploring that.
What's interesting is oftentimes when we hear people talking about career paths for women and career opportunities for women, and maybe this is where you were going, it's almost as if there's one or two paths, which one do you want to pick? Rather than recognizing that there are a lot of options because there are a lot of different ways to be successful. But too often the definition of success is a male-centric definition. Do you agree?
Yeah, I mean, I absolutely agree. I think, historically before the 1980s, women generally were not a major part of the workforce. And so the structure of the workforce and what was expected and what success looked like was very predefined by a male dominant workforce. And that was okay, and it's not necessarily wrong today, but what never happened in the 1980s when it was like a mom-olution, right? All these moms said, I don't want to say a mom-olution,
I'm
right?
writing that
They
down.
didn't want to
I've
say.
never heard that.
So they didn't want to stay home anymore. They wanted to have fulfillment both in being a mother and in being in the workforce. And so they started to explore what that might look like. But the model or how we show up in the workforce was never really adjusted. It was never really changed to take that into consideration. So then over the past, 30, 40 years, women have been trying to be what success was defined as when it was a male dominant workforce, instead of actually redesigning and redefining what success might look like when you have multiple sort of pulls on your time, when you fill multiple roles. And the really cool thing I think about even thinking about that is that now our male counterparts are wanting to have the same discussion because society has changed a lot, right? Like young men who are starting families, they want to be home just as much as the young women who are starting families, and they want to have that balance as much as the young women who want to have that balance. So now it's not even a gender discussion. Now we're talking about how do we change the model in the workforce so that people feel successful in work and in life, and what do we do? What do we do there? What does that look like? So I just find it to be very, very exciting that women sort of have lived it for the last 30 years. And now we're really having a conversation about what do we do about it? How do we change that?
COVID has been devastating for our society, and it has presented so many different challenges to businesses, large and small. But it's also presented some interesting opportunities, including what you're talking about, expanding the dialogue, because and I don't want to make this solely that, women good, men bad. This isn't the point of the conversation. I think that there's been a lot of awareness for men who historically haven't been significantly a part of their family because they were part of those roles. They were playing those roles as well, whether they wanted to or not. And so now there's freedom to have those conversations about what does success look like. Before we go further, I wanted to read, I tried to find a really good definition of lived experience. And the one I ended up with was Wikipedia. I say that not in disrespect, but there's so many of them. So it reads, it's a qualitative phenomenological whatever that means, research, lived experience refers to a representation of the experiences and choices of a person and the knowledge they gain from those experiences and choices. And when we talk about possible solutions for women in the workforce and different career paths, the conversation around diversity and inclusion is often the D&I committee trying to come up with solutions for people rather than inviting those perspectives in and letting their lived experiences inform the conversation. So what are the things you think women can bring to this dialogue that maybe hasn't been included in that? How does it matter what my experience is? I don't represent all women.
Yeah, so I think that's the first fallacy when we start having these conversations, right? Is the mindset that by including one person who may represent an entire group of people, that you're capturing that entire group's mindset. So that's fallacy number one. Fallacy number two is that because of that, then if you say, okay, that's not true, we need to get a bigger sample size and really get our arms around, what is a shared experience that this group has gone through, which sort of gives them a different insight. Then you also have to say, but we have to be excited about that individual's lived experiences because that brings something new to the table as well. So not just as a representative of the group. So, as a woman, I'd love to be a representative of woman, knowing that I don't know everything about every woman and her experience, but also being recognized as an individual to say, yeah, but those are Lindsay's experiences, and this was what shaped her. And so it's hard. It's hard work, and I think that's why the needle hasn't moved as much as we all wish it would move, because the work is so hard, because we're doing individual work and we're doing group work and we're trying to hear the stories, and sometimes we just get tired, right? Like you're just fatigued. You're like, I can't listen anymore. But I do think, there's so much value in hearing what someone is sharing about how they were shaped and why things matter to them, that can often be applied to others who have a similar background.
And to your point, Lindsay's experience is also right here in this organization. That's valuable perspective. So I want to go to our first polling question. And before I do that, I want to mention, and was talking about the challenges of COVID. And one of the things we know that happened with COVID is there was a disproportionate impact on women, and women having to make sometimes some difficult choices about making changes in their careers. And so I wanted to put that out there because our first polling question sort of relates to that. So Beryl, can we go ahead and launch that first poll?
Of course. Let me go ahead and get that up on everyone's screen. It should be up and available now. Have you considered downshifting your career and leaving the workforce in the last 12 months? And I just want to let everyone know we leave each polling question open for about 60 seconds so you can get those answers in and get your CPE. And if you have any technical trouble, let me know in the questions panel.
I also want to invite our attendees to add questions throughout the session. I'll be pulling them up, and sometimes the questions are comments. And Mike said, my 6-year-old daughter says, Daddy, you should fire work. And so thank goodness that is no longer the place. Or the case. So thank you. I thought that was cute.
I love that. Very, very early in my public accounting career, my kids actually didn't know that there were physical seasons. It was just busy season, extension season, off season, and planning season. So they knew how much I would be around depending on which tax season I was in. So sad but true.
All right, I'm going to go ahead and shut this poll down in 3, 2, and 1. Closing that out, and let me share the results for you both. It looks like 56% are saying no, 36% saying yes.
So I love that story, Lindsay. Thank you. It means that the holidays were during planning season. We went to the beach during extension season. I can just imagine what happened in school if the teacher asked a question like, well, we only do that in extension season. But anyway. So
Totally
the
true.
poll question said 36% considered downshifting their career or leaving the workforce in the last 12 months. And we didn't ask if it was pandemic related, but I think that it's not just that, it's about career choices. Have you been seeing any of that in your work at the AICPA, at the Women's Initiatives Committee?
Yeah, so there was a study done by McKinsey in 2021 that actually had the same, very similar to results to what this group of individuals has shared with us. It was 1 out of every 3 women have considered leaving the workforce or downshifting their career. And so we use that study when we're talking. It's we call it WIC, is the shorthand for Women's Initiatives Executive Committee. Easier to get out faster. But we have discussions around, okay, so what does this mean for women in the accounting profession? And what tools or resources should we be looking to create to make sure that the women that are in the accounting profession feel like they have a place to go or have a path to consider? And so this year we actually created, I believe it's live, what we call a career break toolkit. And it's actually a toolkit to help both employers and employees have crucial conversations around what that looks like. So if you really are to the point where you're considering, I really just need to downshift, I need to take a step back because I have all these other commitments and it's just not the right time for me to be super focused on work. How do you have that conversation with your employer so that you have a place to return, or you're really downshifting to the level that you are happy with and your employer knows exactly what to expect? And it's a really, really cool tool. And it was really fun. Like just the concept of it when the team was talking about, hey, we should do this, was like, man, like it's so simple, but really we avoid those conversations like the plague, right? I don't want to admit that I need to take a break. Certainly that's my personality. And then I'm mortified of what my boss is going to say when I say, well, I only want to work 30 hours a week. And, you know, what does that mean for my career? Am I just shooting myself in the foot because I won't have any opportunities later? And I'm afraid to have those conversations. So having a roadmap to have those conversations can be really impactful for what women can create for themselves. And again, back to your point, how do we define success?
You know, it's interesting. When I started my practice, I had a practice for 17 years. And when I started my practice, I got pregnant. That wasn't the plan because you don't usually start and it was during tax season. Don't you just love it? And so I had a tough decision to make. And I decided, you know, the timing doesn't matter. I'm going to follow, you know, it's in the cards, if you will. And rather than downsize my practice, I found a way to bring my son to work with me. Now, the benefit of it was I was self-employed and I could do that. But I quickly learned that my clients didn't care. They just wanted to make sure that I was available, responsive, could provide the services. And my son ended up getting a lot of aunts and uncles in the process. I got quite a bit of free toys and clothes from my clients. And what I learned is that if we talk to our clients, if we talk to our customers, we'd be surprised at how flexible they are. And this was back in a long time ago when he was born. I won't say how many years it is, but today we're learning more of that through COVID. Have you seen or heard even anecdotally that there's finally more of that happening, that people are talking to their clients, especially if women want to downsize their career, they don't have to lose their opportunities because they've decided to cut back to 30 hours or something like that?
Yeah, we just internal to BPM, we've had multiple conversations on, you know, how do we facilitate making sure that, you know, our top performing people, regardless of the number of hours they are able to be here or choose to be here, you know, how do we make sure that we facilitate their ability to continue developing, right? It's not just how many clients can they serve or how many CP hours do they get. It's really about how do we keep them connected? How do we keep them engaged? How do we keep them developing so that when they're ready to hit the ground running again, when whatever's going on in their personal lives is ready to take a little bit of a backseat again and they really want to focus on developing here, that we're ready and ready to support them doing that. And I think all over the profession, you know, even as the members on the WIC committee are talking about their organizations and conversations that they're having about how do we support not just women, but all of our colleagues who are feeling burnt out and are saying, gosh, like I can't do another busy season like I just did. I don't have it in me. Those are a lot of conversations that are going on. And I think it's great the conversations are happening. Now we just have to put some action steps to it, right? It's great to have the discussion, but then what are we going to do about it?
I love the fact that you just said that not just for women, but for everyone. And yes, so Women's History Month is important because it helps draw attention to the issues of gender. As we've seen more work around diversity and inclusion, some of the conversation is pulled away from gender. And so I think it's important that we recenter on that and recognize that if it's an issue for women, it's an issue for everyone. And you just talked about people needing to pull back or make those changes. And one of the questions you had proposed we ask has to do with well-being and recognizing the importance of that in DEI efforts. Can you talk a little bit about that before we go to the polling question?
Yeah, I think that in general, and again, this comes back to societal norms. So I don't want anyone to assume that I'm stereotyping that every individual based on their gender has these traits. That's not correct. But societally, the expectation is historically women have been more in a caregiver role. However, that shows up in their personal lives, whether you have children or don't, have elder care parents, whatever it might be for you. Generally, the societal expectation is that women are caregivers. So when the pandemic hit, in the McKinsey study, there were more women than men who took time off from work or who worked from home and also educated their children, took care of elder parents, did the home type care activities. And as a result, we're still trying to balance the same level of work productivity and functionality as they were before, but now adding in this extra role. And it was really, it was just a lot. It was just a lot. And so what happened is that women naturally stepped into this role at the workplace. So as our colleagues were also becoming burnt out, and as our colleagues were saying, I'm mentally tapped, I need support, I just need someone to listen to me, in general, and we'll see this, McKinsey had another study too, and I don't know, I think that one is on slide number 4, but McKinsey actually polled managers and said, hey, okay, let's look at men and women, and as a manager, how much percentage of your time are you consistently taking these actions? And so it's just, it's not like a huge gulf, right? Like we're not talking 30% or 40% difference, but think of the hours difference that would take if, you know, of women managers, 6% more are working to ensure that the workload of their team members is manageable. That's a huge commitment of time, right? So you look at this disparity and you say, well, gosh, you know, how much time do you all feel like you're spending on well-being or DEI efforts in your organizations? And it's not your role, right? So if you're not the director of DEI or you're not the HR well-being, you know, director of those things, but as in your role, your normal role, how much additional time are you spending on DEI efforts or on well-being initiatives?
So often when I'm talking with my guests, I get attacked by ideas. That's what I call it. And I don't always write them down. But what I did write down just now was another phenomenon that I've heard people, it's always been there, but we're talking about it more openly. And so those women who were doing that, they were picking up all of the extra work. And there was so much more transparency because we can see the kid in the background. We can hear the kid or the dog barking, whatever the case may be. And sometimes we could just see the fatigue. Perhaps women wear more on their sleeves. I know that's not gender specific. But so when this was happening with women, it was just, you know, oh yeah, we know, we understand, and we're sympathetic. But when it happened with a man, he would get recognized for the work. And so men would get credit for having to watch their child for 2 hours or 4 hours or doing something that day, but we take it for granted when a woman is doing it all the time. And I wonder if, so I have on the screen here, what you're referring to, providing emotional support, checking in with overall well-being. And you're not the DEI person. That was the other idea that attacked me. That you're not the DEI person. Inclusion is everyone's role. The DEI person is coordinating those efforts and making sure we're accountable and we're being intentional as an organization. But each of us has a role to play, including putting your arm around your colleague and making sure they're okay. Even if it's emotional well-being, it doesn't have to be a question of race or it doesn't have to be a question of gender. It's just a question of, I'm not quite ready. I'm not there yet today. I'm not having it together. I'm struggling.
Yeah, that sense of belonging, right? That is on all of us to create that sense of belonging in every interaction we have all day.
Exactly.
But whether or not we all do it intentionally is a whole nother conversation, right?
What's interesting here as I look at the statistic is when you talk about helping, the bottom one says helping take actions to prevent or manage burnout, 16% versus 21%. That's a huge difference. or the helping navigate work-life challenges. I'll say this for myself, that it was 29% for women isn't surprising. That it was 24% for men was. So to be fair, my bias is showing. I actually expected that number to be a little bit lower. So I don't know if anybody else has found that interesting when you start looking at the data, that it shows up differently. One, I'm not giving men credit enough for a couple of things. And women, I'm not necessarily acknowledging some of the barriers that I've even experienced. I just take it for granted. It's just my life. So anyway.
Yeah.
What time is it? 3:25. Okay, now I'm trying to do polling question math in my head. I'm a CPA and I do not do arithmetic. So Beryl, you let us know when we're sort of at the equal point of doing the polling questions.
We should do a poll in the next 5 minutes or so. If you want me to launch it now, I can.
No, it's okay. We'll wait.
All right.
4 minutes. Just remind me so I don't lose track. So there's a question that came in, or maybe it's a comment. Let me read it through if I can. I'm a father and I worked in a workplace that didn't let fathers take vacation. Ask Hannibal Johnson. He's a diversity inclusion consultant. Black and indicated men can be discriminated against. I'm not sure what indicated men means. Against, check out his book, such as Black Wall Street. Okay, it wasn't a question. it was a comment. But do you have anything in response to that?
I think it's spot on, right? Any time that you get into intersectionality, right? So when you add women of color to the conversation about gender, when you add male minorities to the conversation of men in the workforce, there absolutely becomes more complexity and discord in terms of how things are moving forward for them. And so I think to his point, fathers not being able to take vacation, again, there's such an opportunity here for women who have run the gambit, from the 80s on, trying to say, how do we do this? How do we make sure that we have time with our family? How do we make sure we can do the grocery shopping? Advocating for the men who are now experiencing that. If you're a dad and you want to be with your kids, or if you want to take a vacation because you're burnt out, then absolutely I want to advocate for that, because I have lived it, right? Now we have a lived experience that we're sharing, and I want you to know that I hear you, I have lived it, and I want better for you, and I want better for me. And I think those are the way that DEI, that the needle starts moving, because you look at that intersectionality and you say, well, Jina, I'm a woman, but I'm not a woman of color. So how is your experience different from mine? How can I advocate to make sure that you are heard and that we do something better? Because I don't know. I never lived it. I need to hear what you live so I can do something.
It's funny you say that, because when we think, so I love, it was Kimberly Crenshaw that coined that term back in, I think it was 89. Was it 89? And it was coined as a legal term. The idea is that there are different aspects of our personality that sort of intersect. They affect us differently. But when you start to look at all those differences and how they come together in a person, it really does speak to our individual perspectives and experiences. And it's such an important point, because I'm a woman and I'm Black. You're a woman and presumably you're white. It's funny, we just make assumptions based on what we see. And so we might have differences of color, but maybe we come from a very similar socioeconomic background. Or what if I come from a wealthy Black family and you come from a family that isn't wealthy? And is in a different socioeconomic strata, and we're making all kinds of assumptions about ourselves. And so until we open this up and have a vulnerable conversation to share what our experiences are, we're going to get a little stuck in this progress. We mean well, but until we can open it up and create space for sharing that information. And I don't know that women have always been that open to share, because we then have to be more vulnerable. Does that make sense?
Yes. I mean, from the very beginning, you're taught how to be a girl. I mean, all of us as young girls were taught, girls like pink and girls like dolls and girls. And I think that's shifting. I think that's not as important as it was, at least when I was a kid. But then, you grow up in that. So then being emotional in the workplace, right? So you're supposed to have emotions in your personal life. But then being emotional in the workplace is considered a negative. So then, but then you go to all these leadership development trainings, and you got Brene Brown out there telling us, be vulnerable, lead with vulnerability, and you're like, but I just learned how not to be that
Right.
so I could fit in, and I'm trying to figure that out. And so, yeah, I think each of us has our own, like you said, lived experiences, and I make assumptions about, I think women in general, and in fact, we talk about this on WIC of women sponsoring women is just as important as men allies sponsoring women, because sometimes I think we think if I could do it, so could every other woman. Just because I had a kid at 19 and I went to college and I got a job, then every other woman who comes after me should be able to do it exactly how I did it, even though I cried myself to sleep at night. Like, why would we wish that on anyone? So we just have to do better about that. We as women have to lead by example as well and be willing to have those conversations.
So fascinating. All right, so we're at that mark where we'll take a polling question, and then I want to come back to the point you were just making.
Great. Let me go
Perfect.
ahead and launch our second of 4 polls. What percentage of your time is spent on well-being and or DEI efforts? Leave this poll open for 60 seconds.
While that's open, I'll share what you just said. My son, my younger son, he really loved to cook. And so for Christmas one year, we wanted to get him one of those toy kitchens that you can get. So, we go back then, there was a Toys R Us. And so we went to Toys R Us, and all of the kitchen sets, the nice ones, were pink and flowery and had unicorns and butterflies on them. And it was the first time that the gender differences sort of smacked me over the top of my head. And we debated getting one of those for him. And we ended up getting one that was sort of neutral. It wasn't a girly girl type thing, but it wasn't it wasn't sort of devoid of any decoration. It is also the least interesting one that was there. It didn't have all the bells and whistles. So anyway, all right. So we're almost at the end of the poll, and it's interesting to see the responses.
Let me go ahead and close that down, and I'll share those results with you. 49% saying 0 to 14%, and 31% saying 15 to 29%.
That's awesome.
I always
I'm
get
excited
confused.
to
Yes,
that,
I wrote my answer.
1/3 group in there that's great.
Yeah, that's fantastic because it means the conversations are starting to happen. I wonder if we'd asked this question 5 years ago, if it would have been mostly zeros. And no, we haven't even started it at all. So this is good. So I wanted to come back to your point, and I wrote down women do it too. And I recently was looking at some data around when we are evaluating performance and how women tend to be evaluated lower than men for the same skills and abilities and performance levels, not just by men, but by women as well. So what can we do then as women to recognize this and try to interrupt it, if there will? Are there any strategies that WIC has come up with?
WIC is an ever-evolving resource tool. So I know we have some things around coaching culture, which I think is part of bridging the gap, right? Is creating this idea of coaching is all about asking questions and helping people uncover and discover what already lives inside them, right? So I think that's probably the place to start, because we as women, again, to your point about vulnerability, it's very difficult to just go ahead and open the soul. But if we do that, if I can sit back and say, I'll share a little about myself. So I had a kid at 19, and I went to school after he was born, became a CPA, 8 years after I graduated college, like all this stuff that was backwards and messed up, right?
Non-traditional. Right?
Non-traditional. And if I take a few minutes and really open myself and say, what would have really made a difference to me? Like that when I was 19 years old and I was in tears because I thought my life was over and I was never going to accomplish anything because now I was just a teen mom. Like what would have made a difference for me? And then what am I offering to the world now? So am I doing anything to change the experience of someone who may be in a similar situation? Or, becoming a CPA was so hard. Like it was so hard to already be a parent and be working full time and then also trying to study for your exam. What would I wish for back then? And then what am I trying to create now? Am I doing anything with that? Am I supportive? And so I think for us as women look at skill sets and we look at evaluations, you really have to kind of dig in deep and say, how hard did I have to work to get the same evaluative score as my male colleagues? And do I want that for the women that are coming after me? And I think most of us would honestly say, no, we don't want that. So then what action can I take? And I think then you get into the actions of what bias remains in the system. How does the evaluation process work? Is there any inherent bias that's showing up in the systematized way in which we do evaluations? How much is objective versus subjective? And really kind of digging into the actual process. And once we do that, I think we get to a point where we can kind of see that even itself out and say, oh, now we're actually saying, can you do X? Yes or no, right? Like there is no, how
Have
well
you
do
done
you do
X?
X?
Yes.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
And so the other thing I wrote down is I wrote the word dismissed, and I'm thinking back to just the title, lived experience, and this natural tendency for us all to, you can only, the filters you have are based on the experiences you've lived. And so if someone else has lived an experience, I haven't, and I have never heard of even that experience, it falls into the realm of a complete blind spot. I didn't know what I didn't know. We run the risk of dismissing it completely. So how do you address this? And I'm just sort of asking this woman to woman. You may or may not have an idea about this. Sorry if I'm putting you on the spot. But how do you address if you're trying to engage, you're sharing your experiences, and you feel like it's not being heard? Is there something that we can do as the person seeking to be heard? Is there something that we can do as the person inviting input to check ourselves to make sure we're creating space for those other experiences and not just dismissing them as, oh, that I can't believe that even happens, and then moving back on again?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a couple of things that we can do. The first is, really that coaching mindset. So any conversation that you go into, even when it's based on you sharing your story and making sure that you're heard, is to really keep asking, even if you don't ask it out loud, where are they coming from? Where have they been? Where are they at on their journey? Are they ready to hear this part of it? Is this going to be too uncomfortable for them? And not to say that you have to filter yourself, but really, I find that I can be really reactive. So if it's something like I've never heard of before, and it's to me like something awful, right? My face is going to show it, and I'll be like, oh, just overreactive,
What was that
which does
expression you just?
like, and which is not what I intend, but but I know it will happen, and I don't ever want someone else to feel like, oh my gosh, like now she hates me because I shared this thing about myself, and like, and my reaction was not about you, it was whatever you shared, the story itself, right?
Yeah.
And so I try and make sure I give the people that grace too when they make a face, or have a response or a reaction, or maybe they seem a little bit disengaged or they're not connected to the story. I kind of check back in just mentally with myself, like, hey, have I asked them a question about where they're coming from? Have I asked them about what's important to them? And I want to speak the same language, and that's really hard when we don't have shared experiences. Our language is different. So that's part of it, is kind of that coaching. What questions can you ask so that it's more of a conversation instead of me just like spitting out everything about myself. And then the other thing is just giving grace. The reality is 9 times out of 10, people are really good people, and you don't know what you don't know, right? So I think when you feel dismissed, it's usually not personal, and it's usually not because you're doing something wrong. It has something to do with how they're feeling. And so just giving them grace, just giving them another opportunity, not only say, you get one chance, I'm going to talk to you.
Exactly.
If I don't get what I need from you, I'm done. It's really like, right. No, we're in this together, and there's gonna be times I'm probably angry with you. You hurt my feelings, whatever feelings I'm having. And there's gonna be times you have those feelings too. And so we just need to give each other grace and say, that's okay. Like, that's okay. And we'll come back to it. And that takes, again, a lot of work.
There's a quote, and I've been struggling to remember it. It's one of the, there's the safe zone rules that exist. It's something like, assume innocence and acknowledge the harm. Mm-hmm. And so what I hear you saying is, they may have said that it landed wrong, but I'm going to assume good intent. And by assuming good intent, I can stay present and we can continue to engage in the dialogue, or at least I can be less reactive, engage in the dialogue. And I also heard you saying, we sometimes need to think about picking the time and the place and the context for what we share. There's this idea that, for example, there's a lot of talk about authenticity in the workforce and bringing your whole self to work. But bringing your whole self to work doesn't mean literally saying what you want, how you want, where you want, because that's authentic. You still have to be respectful and mindful, and it has to be appropriate. And the same is true for trying to work through differences of experiences to achieve a better outcome in terms of culture. So those are the things that I heard. And I just wanted to make sure that I heard that right.
You heard them, that you said them so much better than I did. So I'm very grateful that you repeated that. I'm like, oh, that was so succinct. I'm just going to take some notes over here.
Could you
Great.
please tell my husband I was succinct?
Yeah.
I want to I'm jumping around. I'm looking at your slides. Actually, let's look at this one real quick. We didn't look at it, but importance and recognition of employee well-being at work.
This is one of my favorite slides.
You touched on this earlier, and I'm glad we're coming back to it. We're not supposed to have feelings at work. This isn't emotional. This is work. So leave that at home. And it's particularly difficult for women. You said it earlier. Be vulnerable, but don't be too vulnerable. But be vulnerable in a strong way. But be vulnerable in a manager. And the other Brene Brown video, by the way, is Brene Brown on empathy. I love that cartoon, because until I can understand what you are going through, how can I lead and manage a team if I don't know what their experiences are? So here you're talking about that difference, that well-being is a holistic term. It is not meaning everyone's in a good mood, right? Mm-hmm. And we have to understand that as well.
Yeah. And what I find interesting about this data, again, McKinsey, they're one of my favorites for this study, just because this study in particular that they do of women in the workforce tends to just garner so many nuggets of cool pieces of data. But what I love about this is that in a survey, right, an employer says that this is what they get substantial formal recognition from. So the blue circle is the work they do around DEI and well-being, and the gray circle is the work they were recognized formally for as it relates to those. And it makes me chuckle, because I think, the pandemic, I think, has moved the needle a little bit in terms of organizations being intentional about providing well-being support, and making DEI initiatives a priority for the organization. But there's still that missing piece of, okay, well, how do we call out, and how do we recognize, and how do we make sure that we're saying we want our actions to match up with our words? And so if we say DEI is our number one focus this year, or well-being of our employees is our number one focus, and then we have team members who are spending a lot of time helping us invest in that, but we don't actually recognize them for it, then now there's this discord between what we said and then what we did.
Right.
And then people stop wanting to do it, right? So this 87% that said, it's the work is critical, but we're only recognizing 25% of it. Those people that were doing that 87% of work, next year, they're not really going to want to do it, right? Because now, there's no recognition. And this doesn't mean a recognition in terms of compensation or anything else. This could be as simple as, thank you so much, job well done. And so yeah, we just
goes a long way, and people think employee recognition is awards. Mm-hmm. Afraid to recognize someone because somebody's going to expect a promotion, rather than none of us want to be invisible.
Yeah,
it's really as simple as your manager saying, "I saw that and I noticed it, and it's powerful. Thank you."
Or saying it in front of others, which is even more powerful, right? So me getting the feedback of, hey, great job, we appreciate you, is awesome. But even cooler is when my boss gets an email from someone that says, oh my gosh, Lindsay did this so well. That is you just advocated for me. Thank you so much for putting yourself out on the line for my success. That is so appreciated. So little things like that really go a long way and give us an opportunity to do it, very easily, right? We don't have to do a whole lot around it.
Speaking of dropping nuggets here, I wrote down, you said, quote, move the needle a little bit. And what I thought was, we also just let people know there was a needle to be moved in the first place, because we haven't always known the needle was there, let alone to move it. And then you also talked about, hey, you just advocated for me. And it brought up two things. One, amplification, which is if you do something, I can help raise awareness for what you did simply by restating it and attributing it back to you. But then also part of being an ally, and a lot of people think allyship is only me being a champion for a group I'm not in. Yes, that's important. As a Black woman, I can be an ally for Latinos. As a person with an invisible disability, I can be an ally for those with disabilities who are visible. But I can also be an ally for other women because you mentioned earlier how we ourselves can be the ones that are harshest on ourselves. And so that's really important. And I wanted to bring this up because, one, I know you wanted to ask a question about it, and you have this slide. I think I'm on the wrong screen here. This slide where you're talking about people showing up as allies. What is it about this that called you to share it here?
So I think, going back to our intersectionality conversation, I think sometimes, I'll just talk about myself. Sometimes it's uncomfortable for me to acknowledge that I'm white. Sometimes I get like this weird, like, is somebody going to think that I'm not an ally, a friend, I'm a champion because I'm just acknowledging that I'm white? And so like there's these weird feelings of even talking about the fact that I'm white. So this spoke to me because I thought, man, how often is this really playing out where 77% of white employees that were surveyed said we think we're showing up as allies for women of color, specifically at work. And then they said, okay, well, what actions are you taking? And then a much lower percentage of actual actions occurring. And so things like advocating for new opportunities of women of color when those come, giving credit to women of color for their ideas and their contributions. Those things aren't happening at the same level as the number of people saying, oh yeah, I'm 100% an ally. And so I think there's two things that happen there. One is we probably don't have a super clear definition of what allyship is.
Right.
And there's actions related to being an ally. So that's probably the first thing. And the second thing is executing, right?
Yeah.
Like we just forget, right? It's not top of mind. And so unless we have some kind of plan or a goal set around it, taking that action takes effort. And if it's not a focus for us, we'll just kind of forget about it. And not because we don't care about the groups that are marginalized around us. I don't think that's the case. I don't think you have 77% of employees saying, oh my gosh, we're allies, and they actually don't care about those marginalized groups. I don't think that's the case. But I do think there's a disconnect there of you have to take action. You can't just say I'm an ally when you're sitting in a group and someone says something that is, maybe not highlighting or not a nice thing to say about an entire group of people. Do you actually step up and say, oh, that's actually not true. I'm not sure where you got your information. Most of us don't. And so then are we really an ally or are we just a champion, right?
Well,
do we just cheer them on from the sidelines?
Yeah, and there's so much there. Wow. Okay. Now I had to write more notes. First of all, you said a lot of people would say yes. And I know there's somebody out there saying, well, some people just say yes because they have to. They feel it's politically the thing to do. And while I acknowledge that's true, let's just dismiss that as the majority. There's always going to be an exception and not a rule. So scratching that off. I also wrote that intention isn't enough. Having good intention. Because it requires action. And what you just said, I think part of the concern is by me taking action, the example you just gave, I'm just throwing my reputation out there as well. And that makes me vulnerable. It's one thing to say, hey, no, that was good. And it's another thing for me to be a champion of something that might create tension with another colleague. And so you said back to then before that, we don't necessarily have the best definition of allyship. We define advocacy, sponsorship, championship, and mentorship. And as a result of those definitions, we know what to do those things. So I love the idea of having a conversation around what allyship looks like. And there's a general idea of allyship, and it also might vary for different groups. So I'm making that a to-do list for me as well. I need to find a way to define allyship. So before we get in trouble, I do want to launch the polling question about allyship. So Beryl, can we go ahead and launch that poll?
I was about to unmute. You won't get in trouble though. Let me go ahead and launch polling question number 3. And it's a good question based on what you all were just talking about. What is the most important allyship action to you?
So we
And there's
only have,
probably more.
oh
There's
yeah.
probably more than this. Like this is just from the McKinsey study. So, bear that in mind. This is not an end all be all list. I don't want anyone thinking these are the only 4 things you can do, but
The other thing that's interesting is that, how we answer questions and how it then lines up with, I'm trying to get my slides here, how it lines up with what the data is showing is always interesting. So tying this back to the study is good for that reason. So we have probably 2 or 3 more minutes to go. I put this up on the slide opportunities and lived experiences, because I just wanted to draw that to people's attention before we wrap up. And then I want to give you an opportunity, Lindsay, to share some brilliant last words before we close out. I'm going to give you a moment to think about your brilliance, because there's a lot in there.
oh geez.
No pressure. Go. It's like,
Yeah,
okay, go
no
be
kidding.
innovative.
Whew.
Well, I'm going to say, Lindsay, go be brilliant. Ready, set, go. But you've shared so many good insights. I've just really enjoyed this conversation.
I'll go ahead and close down this third poll. We will have one more polling question before we close out the webinar. Looks like the top answer here was 31% saying attribution for your work and ideas.
It's
It
funny.
would be amazing. I know we can't do it because we don't have all the demographics, but I'm always interested in, Jina, to your point, what you would think is the most important allyship action versus what I might think versus what
Right.
our LGBTQIA plus colleagues might think is the most important action. It's just interesting to really get that feedback, which goes back to what you said at the beginning, which is listening, right? Like really hearing what people need.
And what's interesting is the same action might manifest itself differently.
Mm.
So speaking up, when you see something, say something.
Mm.
What you say and how you say it, sometimes it's in words, sometimes it's in action, sometimes it's publicly, and sometimes it's privately. Because sometimes calling somebody out in a room, well, I don't agree, I think blah, 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 might do more harm than good. Versus after the meeting, I'm going to pull Bob aside and I say, Bob, I heard what you said. I think you really meant well. Here's how I heard that. And if I heard it right, I have to say I don't agree, and I'd love to talk more about that. As opposed to saying, you didn't say it right. There's a way to go about all this. I also wanted to ask you, could you share again the name of the toolkit? I meant to write it down for those who are listening if they wanted to look it up.
You can look up AI CPA Career Break Toolkit. Is that the one you were talking about? The crucial conversation. Yeah.
Career Break Toolkit. Thank you. Terry Larkins put in the comment, does this go back to the tone at the top in corporate culture?
Yes.
Yes, and everything, right?
Yes, all of these things. Yes, 100%.
Well, what leadership does is what we do.
That's right.
We follow the example of leadership just like our kids follow the examples of parents. It doesn't matter what you say. Your kids are doing what you do no matter what you say, right?
Is it do what I say, not what I do? So like the parenting.
Well, I mean, this has been fantastic. I've really enjoyed this conversation. I feel like I could sit here and keep talking to you, but we're going to have to wrap it up. I don't know if you have any final thoughts, or was there something you wanted to touch on that we haven't addressed yet?
It went so fast. I just can't think of where the time went. No, I would just say these conversations take being bold and take being brave, but they also take being kind and being empathetic. And so I think that women in their natural experiences, as they grow up with mothers, as they become mothers, some of us have some very natural talents in these areas. So let those shine, bring those to these conversations. Don't be shy about bringing your caregiver spirit to something that really can use that caregiver spirit. And just lead by example. If this is what you want to see in your organization, start being the one to do it. And people will think you're probably weird, like, oh man, she's gotten touchy-feely on us. And that's great. Like, let them have those thoughts. And then as you start making headway with people and you start really uncovering some things that can be better in your organization, people are going to come along for the ride, because they'll be like, man, that got better for me too. What else can we do? What else can we talk about? But yeah, just keep having the conversations. That's how we have to start, right? I
would add to that, lead with curiosity. And I remember I was watching a YouTube video years ago. It was actually a video of science. I don't remember what it was. It was a science topic. And I remember hearing this phrase, something like, you can't hate something if you're curious about it. And it got me thinking, and I realized because curiosity turns on a different part of the brain. You're trying to puzzle your way through and figure something out. And so there's no room for judgment. And so I would encourage everyone just to lead with curiosity when, just ask more questions, reframe, try to figure out what somebody's thinking about. It doesn't mean you acknowledge it. I mean, it doesn't mean you're even agreeing with it. It's just trying to figure it out. All right. So before we wrap up, I want to remind everybody this is a bi-weekly series. So every other Friday at 3:00 Eastern. Next time, March 18, Dr. Almer, you may know her, I don't know. She's done some work with the AICPA. I was on a panel with her at Engage last year, which is why I wanted to invite her in, because she's done some wonderful research on some of the trends, a lot of different research, but specifically on women in the accounting profession. And so she's going to be joining us to talk about that. So Lindsay, thank you so much for being with me. I appreciate you joining me today.
Thank you so much for the invite. I had a wonderful time. I could talk to you about this for hours. And for all of you that signed on, thank you for being brave enough to have a conversation. I think that's really awesome.
Wonderful. Okay, Beryl, back to you to wrap us up and close us out.
Great. We have one more polling question to launch, and it is, what was the most valuable part of today's webinar? So I'm going to leave that polling question open, and I just want to thank you both for an excellent conversation today. Lots of comments popping up in that questions box. Great discussion. Thank you for a wonderful webinar. The time really did go back quickly, and some of our attendees loving that this is a series that they can join in on again.
Yeah, the webinars, the web page isn't quite set up yet for the next event, so just keep an eye out for it.
It should be up there soon, and yeah, you mark your calendars for the date and come sign up on the CPA Academy site when it's live. All right, we are going to close this polling question out in the next couple seconds. And I'll go ahead and share some of our wrap-up details. At CPA Academy, we're going to process your credit later today. That, along with a copy of this webinar and your handouts, will be available in your CPA Academy accounts within 24 hours. Go ahead and close down this poll. Majority of the audience is saying they learned something new today, which is great, always what we like to hear. And I want to once again thank our wonderful presenters, Jina Etienne and Lindsay Stevenson. Thank you so much. We're appreciative of your time and insights, and a warm thanks to all of you in the audience for your participation today. Don't forget to look in your email inbox for the evaluation link for our webinar. We always appreciate hearing your feedback on our sessions, and check the schedule on our website for when that next session in our series goes live, and for additional information about all our webinars. We hope to see you on a future session. Have a great day, everyone.